to try and find something that Doug didn't already say. Was it Doug? Douglas, yeah, he was comprehensive. Well, thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure to be here. And thank you too for praying for our search for a pastor. Those of you who have seen me before will know I'm usually at Christchurch Baldock with my family. And the last time I was here, we didn't have a pastor lined up. Chris Jenkins, who many of you would have known, had moved on at Christmas. But I'm very pleased to say we've got, and I know you all know this, we've got somebody starting. So thank you all for praying for that. He's coming along in September, and I'm sure you'll all get to meet him in due course. So statistically, it's quite likely that most of you in this room have seen or have at least heard of one of the releases from what we're calling the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the superhero movies. Since 2008, they have released 36 feature films, and they have sold over $31 billion of cinema tickets worldwide. That is a lot of people watching a lot of movies. So most of you will probably recognize, yeah, there you go, that sort of image. That is Tony Stark, the invincible Iron Man, arguably the central character of at least the first decade of those movies. You probably also know the actor playing him is Robert Downey Jr. He was a movie star as a younger man. He had some pretty well-publicized struggles with substance abuse, alcohol, and then his performances in these movies pulled his career back out of the gutter to the point where today he's one of the highest-paid movie stars in the world. But you knew that, right? You knew that was Robert Downey Jr. He played a central character in a series of movies that was pretty much everywhere for about a decade. You couldn't move, you couldn't turn around without seeing something like this. They aren't as prominent now, maybe. Without exaggeration, I think it's fair to say Robert Downey Jr. is a household name, certainly in English-speaking countries. On the other hand, I'd be quite surprised if any of you could name any one of the hundreds and hundreds of visual effects artists who worked on any of those movies, any of the 36. Now, they worked on the same movies that made that enormous success, that made that massive box office that were everywhere you looked, but they didn't become famous. Two workers on one movie, one becomes a household name, and the other one is completely anonymous. Now, it's totally fair to say this guy deserved to be famous. He was note perfect as Iron Man. I grew up reading those comics. He was brilliant. Finding another actor to play the role of Tony Stark anywhere near that well would have been really tricky. There's a very limited number of people who can act in movies, or who can do it well anyway. Being a recovering alcoholic is an important part of Tony Stark. And of course, Robert Downey Jr. had his own experience there. It would have been much more difficult to replace this guy than it would have been to replace a visual effects artist. Far more people have the skills to do that job than have the skills to play Tony Stark. But that doesn't mean that you can do without the visual effects. Without the visual effects, the movies would have looked like this. Without the visual effects, Tony Stark can't put on the armor. Without the visual effects, he can't fly. He can't zap the baddies with the repulsor rays. Without the visual effects, he's not Iron Man. Robert Downey Jr. can bring all the charisma he wants to the role. You don't make billions at the box office on Tony Stark, man in a t-shirt. Yes, they are completely different contributions, and we mustn't say that they're the same, but you do need both. We can't take everything else for granted. There are loads of examples of this sort of thing. As a culture, we love stars. We're obsessed with it. We know that what they do takes a particular set of skills. And we often fall into the trap of thinking that what they do is the only important thing, and the rest doesn't really matter that much. This is a picture of Coldplay. I never used to think I had to explain that, and then I showed it to Chris Jenkins, and he didn't know who they were. I think most of you will recognize that this is Coldplay because you recognize one of these people, right? You recognize the singer. I suspect a lot of you also know his ex-wife. Some of you can probably name at least one of his children. Now, there's only 4 of them, so I'm taking a bit of a risk here. People who are big fans of Coldplay might know the name of some of the other people in the band, but I think if any of you do, it's quite a small number compared to the number of people who could tell me, well, the singer is called Chris Martin. And yet again, being the front man, being the singer, being the face of the band, that is a very particular talent. Replacing Chris Martin would definitely be more difficult than replacing Guy Berryman. That's that one. He's the bassist, just so you know. But still, the other 3 are important. If Coldplay are playing a show and the other 3 don't show up, I'm sure Chris Martin can jam out something on the keyboard, but that is not Coldplay. So, hopefully I've established this. It's okay that Chris Martin's more famous. It's okay that he's the star, but that doesn't mean he's the only one that matters. Today's passage is part of a letter written by Paul. We would, I think it's fair to say, regard Paul as one of the stars, maybe the star of the early church. And it's totally fair to say that Paul was special. I'm not saying anything here against how much he did, what a specific job he had to do, and how well he did it. Let's not downplay that. Paul was chosen by Jesus himself, approached personally, and given the task of taking the gospel out of the area around Israel and into the rest of the world. Paul was very well suited to that job. He had an incredibly deep understanding of the Jewish scriptures. He could explain who Jesus was from history and from prophecy. And above all, Paul was willing to spend his life as a missionary, taking a message that was incredibly unpopular, running away from riots. It's absolutely fair to regard Paul as a star. It's absolutely fair to honor what he did. Finding someone else to do what he did would be like replacing one of these stars in these other contexts. Very hard, maybe even impossible to get someone to do it just as well. But, Paul is really clear in this passage, really clear throughout his letters, that the work of the early church was not just the work of Paul. In fact, Paul is at pains to emphasize people who are not Paul and to show us how important their work is to the spread of the gospel, to show us how much he honors and cares for the people who do that work. So 2 points to dig into here. Let's dig into them. Firstly, all church work is important. All church work is important. Epaphroditus is not a name that you're likely to be familiar with. He's not a person we know very much about. There's this passage and there's another mention right towards the end of the letter. And that's it. That's all we get told. He doesn't come up anywhere else in the Bible. He doesn't come up in the writings of the early church. He's not mentioned by any of the historians. So what is the sum total of what we know about Epaphroditus? Have a look at verse 25 for me, please. At the time that Paul wrote this letter, he was under arrest, waiting for his trial in Rome. He makes a reference in here to, I'll see how it will go with me. That's what he's talking about. See how the trial's going to go. And the way that the empire did that was they kept you under guard. They kept you in your house, but they didn't provide anything. They didn't bring you your meals. The expectation was that people who were under this arrest would be provided for by their family and friends. Paul, of course, was a missionary. He didn't have lots of local friends and family to help support him. What he had was the local church. And so the Philippians sent Epaphroditus as a messenger, not just with news, not just with a word of encouragement, but to take care of his needs. That's the reference in the passage. They sent him, in other words, with financial help for Paul. But Epaphroditus didn't just drop off the money and leave. Verse 25 says, he is also your messenger. Once he arrived in Rome, Epaphroditus spent some time working with Paul and the local church. Notice as well that Paul feels that he needs to tell the Philippians that he's going to send this guy back. That suggests quite strongly that Epaphroditus was going to stay. He was going to do more work in Rome. This isn't just a drop and go. Here's the money. Good luck with the trial. I'll see you later. We also know that Epaphroditus made doing this work a priority in his life. He took some serious risks. Philippi is in Greece, of course. A journey from there to Rome was a lot riskier in those days than just hopping on a flight. It's probably a month of travel. Poor sanitation, very little help if anything went wrong, and through some more remote areas, let's say. Wild animals, bandits perhaps. Bandits perhaps when you're carrying a big bag of cash. Or actually, maybe not even bandits, maybe just people you're traveling with. Outside the cities, there wasn't much law. This was a risky journey. But Epaphroditus went on the journey to enable his church to support Paul. And then verse 27, Epaphroditus has had some sort of serious illness, so serious that he almost dies. We don't know what it was, we don't know exactly how he got it, except this reference in verse 30, that he got it for the work of Christ. Some people assume that that was something he picked up on the journey, that element of work was where he became ill. Others assume that he was going into poorer areas within Rome in the work he was doing while he was in Rome, and that was how he contracted this illness, but we're not told. That is literally everything that we know about Epaphroditus, that he did some church work, and it was a priority for him. That's it. That's all the Bible tells us. Except, it also tells us how Paul describes him in verse 25. A brother, a co-worker, and a fellow soldier. It also tells us, verse 27, that when God decided that Epaphroditus wouldn't die of his illness, that was mercy, not just to Epaphroditus, but to Paul as well. If Epaphroditus had died, that would have been sorrow upon sorrow. The Bible tells us very little about what Epaphroditus did. Did he give impressive speeches in Rome? Maybe. Did he do mighty deeds in the name of Jesus? Maybe. But if he did, we don't need to know. What we do know is how deeply Paul cares about him. On the basis of just those two things, that he did church work and that he made it a priority in his life, even when it was risky, even when it cost him something, the Bible shows us that Paul cares deeply about this man Epaphroditus. Not just that, verse 29, he commands the church in Philippi. You should honor people like this. And that's where the attitude that Paul had, the attitude that Paul tells the church in Philippi to have, and by extension, the attitude that he wants all of us to have, is completely different to how the world expects us to behave. Our instinct is, our culture is telling us, think of somebody like Epaphroditus, whose contribution you don't really know, as less. But no, says Paul. Epaphroditus did God's work. Epaphroditus made God's work a priority in his life. And on that basis, and that basis alone, Epaphroditus is a brother, a co-worker, a fellow soldier, and someone we're commanded to honor. One of the privileges of being a guest speaker is that I don't know you. So you know that when I say the thing I'm about to say, I'm not saying this to you personally. I'm not speaking to your particular situation. So I can get a little bit more practical, and you know that I'm not having a dig at you. I can only get away with this for so long if I keep coming back. But anyway, so let me say this. I think we think of stars in every walk of life, and I'm sorry to say that no church I've ever known has been exempt from that. I doubt that you are either. Maybe it's the pastor or the preachers that you think of as the stars. Maybe it's the service leaders or the musicians or the youth and children's team. Maybe it's as simple as the person who always comes and speaks to you after the service. And again, let's be clear. These are good gifts. These are all service to God. These should all be honored. Please don't take away that I'm suggesting this is not all good. It's right for us to bear in mind that these are hard things to replace. But where it becomes a problem is if we think of the other people, the non-stars, as somehow less. If their acts of service, if their gifts somehow get devalued. Because as Douglas said, the things that we think of, the high-profile things, are not enough on their own to run a church. There are lots and lots of less glamorous jobs, running the sound desk, putting the chairs out, making the tea, The list goes on. We need all of those gifts. We need people willing to serve in all of those roles if we're going to have a functioning church. Again, my friend Douglas has referred to this already. Here's the passage. When Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, he used this exact picture, the parts of the body, all different from each other, all serving a different purpose, all working together in harmony. You need that difference. You can have an amazing preaching team, but if you don't have the musicians, if you don't have the tech team, if you don't have the refreshments, if you don't have the pastoral care, it's not much of a church. All eye, no sense of hearing. Or you could have brilliant Sunday mornings, but if you don't do anything during the week, if you're not reaching out into the estate, then you're not doing your job. God has placed the parts in the body just as he wanted them to be. God has placed people and gifts in each church, in each group, just as he wanted them to be. And if our church is going to work as it should do, if your church is going to work as it should do, then we need all of those parts to do the jobs that God put them there to do. All of those parts, whether glamorous or not. So let's get practical. First, let's honor all church workers. Let's not shortchange the people who do the jobs that are less glamorous, because that is a worldly attitude. That is not a godly one. Most churches are really great at encouraging the people who preach. And again, please don't take this as me saying stop doing that. It is hard work. The encouragement is sorely needed. Your pastor would tell you that if he was here. But are we encouraging the people who do the other jobs? Are we encouraging the people who work with the youth and children, or who bring the prayers, or run the sound desk, or put the chairs out? Are we as good at encouraging the people who do the things during the week that we don't go to? Are we tracking down the people who we know do the work at Meeting Point or Grange Tots and saying, thank you for that, keep going with it, you're doing a great job? Do we even know who does them? All of these people are doing God's work. All of these people are taking the time to prepare. All of these people are using their gifts as service to him, doing the job that they were put in this body to do. So let's honor them and share some of the encouragement with all of the people who work in this church. And secondly, let's ask ourselves, if this worldly attitude of the stars and the rest is creeping into our attitude to church work, does that have an effect on what we're willing to volunteer for? When we're thinking about the ways they can serve, that we can serve, I should say, is there any part of us that feels like some of the jobs are a bit beneath us? That the time and effort that we would need to put in to serve in those ways doesn't quite pay off. Not high profile, not glamorous. Or have we fallen into the opposite trap? Do we see some jobs and think, well, gosh, you've got to be special to do that, and I'm not special enough. I shouldn't put myself forward. Let me say again, God has made you a part of his body here. That means you have a role to play, and that's a role that he has decided. So you should be doing it. If you feel that you can do it, if you feel that you're called to do it, if you see that there's a need to do it, you should be doing it. You shouldn't be ruling yourself out because you don't feel that you're a star. Let's confront those thoughts. Let's confront those attitudes in ourselves. All church work, every part of the body of the church, is important. The second thing to say is some good news for you. If we do offer ourselves in that way, not only does it please God, but it brings joy. There are 4 people in this morning's passage: Paul, Timothy, Epaphroditus, and the Philippian church. And what jumps off the page when you read this passage, when you hear it read, is how deep their bonds are. How much joy they bring each other. I already mentioned verse 25. Paul describes Epaphroditus as his brother, co-worker, and fellow soldier. In verse 22, Paul speaks of Timothy as being like a son to him. Outside of marriage, those are the closest relationships that it's possible to have. All the common purpose and camaraderie of soldiers in a unit together, or 2 members of a team working together on some big project, all of the closeness and understanding of a parent and a child, or 2 brothers. Those are the relationships that Paul's talking about here. when he's talking about his fellow workers. And why is that? Well, again, if we were meant to get a long list of the reasons why these people get along so well, then we would have been given that list, wouldn't we? But there isn't one. What we do have, verse 22, Timothy has served with Paul in the work of the gospel. And of course, we've said before, so has Epaphroditus. Working together for the gospel, serving God together, nothing more, has given them these incredibly close connections. It's not just them. Look at verses 25 and 26. Paul is sending Epaphroditus back to Philippi because he misses not his family, not his friends, not the local food, but his church. He longs for his fellow believers back in Philippi. In fact, he cares so deeply about them that when he realizes that they will have heard about his illness, however that's happened, the church rumor mill, he becomes distressed. Epaphroditus can't concentrate. He's so worried that his home church will be worried about him. He actually knows, by the way, that Paul is going to send this letter and say he's recovered, don't worry. But even so, he needs to see them again. He needs to reassure them personally that he's recovered. That's the strength of the bond between the Philippian church and Epaphroditus. He's fully aware that now that they know he's been ill, they are going to want to see him. And he can't relax until he's made it right. When he arrives home, verse 28, he will stop worrying. They'll be glad to see him. He'll be welcomed with great joy. And not just Epaphroditus either. If you look at the bond between Paul and the church, verse 19, he's planning to send Timothy to see them so that when Timothy comes back, he can bring news. And that news, hearing the progress that they're making, hearing how well things are going, will cheer Paul up. Every believer in this passage takes so much joy when things go well for the others. Every believer in this passage is so concerned for the well-being of the others. And Paul makes the reason very clear. Verse 20, I think, is the key here. He's sending Timothy specifically because Timothy will show genuine concern for the church in Philippi. So he's confident that Timothy will have this strong bond the way that Paul does. That's why Paul wants to send him to this church that he loves. Why is that? Verse 21, everyone else looks out for their own interests, but Timothy looks out for the interests of Jesus Christ. That should be the key for us, I think. It's not that Timothy is being sent because he will care about this church because he has a particular heart for pastoral ministry. Timothy won't care about this church because he's just a naturally unselfish guy. Timothy will care about this church because Timothy has put God's priorities first. And if you put God's priorities first, he cares about other believers. That is what that means. It's that simple. It's been one of the themes in the letter more broadly, and we don't have time to recap the whole thing, but just glance up at verse 7, if you don't mind, of chapter 2. He, that is Jesus, made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant. If we're trying to emulate that person, if we're trying to follow that Lord who took the very nature of a servant, then naturally we will serve too. As you follow Jesus, as you become more like him, you will care about his people more and more. The more you care about them, the more you put their interests ahead of your own, the more you will work. It feeds itself. It's a cycle. The more work you do, the more the relationships deepen, the more you will care. And so on. I hope that you've felt the truth of this passage for yourself, if you're serving here. I hope that you've seen for yourselves the deepening of relationships with the people that you're serving with. I hope that you feel the joy of serving Christ's people. I hope that you feel the joy of playing out, having a little bit of the heart for those people that Jesus himself has for them. And let me just make a note before I finish. There will be times in your life when, for whatever reason, you might need to pull back a little bit. You might need to serve a little bit less. That's not something to be ashamed of. That is in this passage as well. When Paul saw that Epaphroditus was suffering, that he was distressed, he sent Epaphroditus back to Philippi. He was working in Rome. He was on the front line. And Paul said, no, this guy needs a minute. He needs to go back. He needs to see them. He needs to be restored. That's okay. There will be seasons where we need a break, where we need to reduce our time commitment, where we need to come off a rota. I'm yet to be allowed to do it, but I understand it is possible. If we're serving out of genuine care for Christ's people, that's okay. We will be back. So let me leave you with those thoughts this morning. There is no church work that isn't valuable. There is no church work that is not important. So let's honor that work, whatever role it is in our churches, and let's challenge our own attitudes in what we're willing to volunteer for. And let me encourage you that as you serve alongside God's people, as you work with them, as you fight side by side with them, that care and that bond will grow. When you can help a fellow believer who is suffering, like Paul sending Epaphroditus home, it will bring you joy. When you recognize people's work as service to God, like the Philippian church welcoming him back, it will bring you joy. When you see your fellow believers growing and strengthening in their faith, when you see the people that you're serving becoming more and more like Jesus, just as you do, like Paul with Timothy and Epaphroditus, that will bring you joy too.